Sorry, just as an aside thing, so the Dominion of New England, at the time of, if I can keep my British king straight, James II, they tried to increase their control over their colonial possessions. Or England tried to in the New World. And as part of this effort, they reorganized some things. And in this reorganization, they essentially wanted to combine all of the New England states and New York into one super colony. They ended temporarily like all land tenure, and did all these different things. And so this became very controversial. He actually took away the Massachusetts State Charter, and the Massachusetts people had to go over and get a new one. While the senior leaders of the Mass Bay Colony were getting the new charter, that's actually when the Salem witch trials happening. But as Andros was being attacked and sent back, simultaneously with this, in England, the Glorious Revolution is going on. And so James II gets overthrown, and this is where they bring in William and Mary from the House of Orange. And so then it's sort of seen as the Glorious Revolution on this side of the Atlantic, and it's okay what they did. And they sort of get their charter rights back afterwards. Sorry, what was that? Any other questions?
Did you know that final version that I have there?
Yes, I have heard that.
Did you also know that? Dude, you better say something. Anything about? Did you also know that I lost 2 erasers in the span of
I was not aware of your unfortunate loss. I'm not certain of the relevance of it to our current discussions, though.
Do you know how to play with odds?
Odds are not. Quiz!
I'm not stalling. That was like a serious question.
This is a serious quiz. I've just been randomly selecting a doctor each day. At some point, I'm going to run out of energy to make new ones.
Apparently, I'm a front runner for the award, though.
many people are still working? About 2 more minutes. I partially lost track of time. All right, we start handing the quizzes in.
And then if mine
Please don't double sign hand things in. If they're shared with me,
We'll see, I'm not sure, I'm not positive. I'm not changing. What do you like to?
Jim, let me say this briefly. Given the quantity of review essays that I'm trying to grade right now, I would really prefer not to grade the same review essay outlines twice. That's already happened in a number of cases, and it has a tendency to make me sad. But
I don't want to make you sad.
so what I would ask you to do is only hand it in once. So if it's shared with me, what gets super awkward in this case, and to be honest, this does happen from time to time, is I think every single one was the same this time. But sometimes you're sitting there, do I give it 18? Do I give it 17? I don't know. And then the question is, do you give it this, like, if you grade the same thing? I did this, I think, with Andrew, actually.
Oh, God.
Where I was like, wait, and then I looked, and then it was forced, it was like the same comments. But these were ones I got from before the break. But anyways, so number 1, which of the following groups would have been most likely to support Calhoun's views expressed in the excerpt?
Southern landowners.
C, Southern landowners. Which of the following most directly undermines Calhoun's assertions? B, many slaves engaged in forms of resistance to slavery. The 1840s and 1850s, the views expressed by Calhoun most directly contributed to beta, increased sectional division. Which of the following most directly helped maintain the balance between the northern and southern parts of the United States before the Mexican-American War referenced in the excerpt? D, the passage of the Missouri Compromise. Which of the following historical developments during the 19th century best supports Potter's argument about the underlying cause of sectional conflict? Now, I have to be completely honest with you folks on this one. I had to look up the answer.
Yeah, the question, like, it was number 5. What was the answer?
The answer is B.
Oh, okay.
But so this was, I think, a really hard question. And remember what they're trying to do. I mean, I would have said B, but I wanted to check the answer sheet. I wasn't confident. And remember what they're trying to do is test your application of historical thinking skills, not so much your factual recall. And so, what?
That was a lot more than
Well, the problem is,
It kind of answers, but also.
Much of the national harmony had rested upon the existence of a kind of balance between northern and southern parts of the United States. The decision to fight the Mexican-American War had disturbed this balance, and the acquisition of a new empire, which each section desired to dominate, endangered the balance further. And so, where's the empire? It's in the West. And so, there's nothing in here that relates to voting rights for white males. There's nothing in here about Irish and German immigrants to northern cities. There's nothing in here about the increasing prominence of the Whig Party. In fact, during this time period, the Whig Party is rapidly declining. And so the only thing that makes sense is increase in economic opportunities in the West, and both North and South want to be able to control those economic opportunities for their respective labor savings. Does that help, Ellie? The acquisition of a new empire referenced in the excerpt most directly fostered sectional division through the beta renewed debate over the expansion of slavery, and which of the following most directly contributed to the decision by the United States to fight the Mexican-American War? Alpha, the idea of manifest destiny. And then old style question, which of the following principles was established by the Dred Scott decision? This is old style factoid 1. The correct answer is B. Well, see, that is a perfect example of the type of why they've changed to the newer style AP questions. Because, I mean, what does the Dred Scott decision do? It declares that African Americans are not people, are not citizens under the Constitution, and therefore don't have rights and can't sue. It declares the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional. It says Congress cannot legislate on slavery in the territories. It implies that popular sovereignty is unconstitutional, and that slaves are a property right and people can take their slaves wherever they want. And so you have to know, in effect, all of those things to be able to go through one by process of elimination and get that right. So that's a little bit tricky, yes.
This is a question from Harold Becker. You may know him. He wanted to know, it kind of relates. He wanted to know if you believe that if the North had won the battle of, what did he say? It was like Bull Run, but he's used a different word for it. Manassas. Yeah, he wanted to know if you think if the North had won that, if slavery would have continued. And like how they would have stopped slavery after that, like how it would have ended. And I said I don't know, so he told me to ask you.
Early in the war.
I don't know that Bull Run was conclusive enough for me to have a judgment on that one way or the other. I think the better question is what would have happened had the North been successful in the First Peninsular Campaign of 1862, which in many ways they should have been. In which case, Richmond would have surrendered, the South would have been subdued, or at least Lee's army would have been defeated, with slavery still intact. In which case, I don't know. I mean, then you're spinning out all sorts of possibilities.
Could someone write a final essay on that?
Oh, that would be actually kind of an interesting seminar though, like how do you think slavery could have been ended?
It would be
Here's
like
what I'll say, though.
history kind of.
And
That'd be cool.
And this is a place where being excessively focused on one nation's story can be deceptive for people. Every single country in the world abolishes slavery between 1790 and like 1886. Every single country in the world. In only 2 of those countries does it require a war. The others hate. Well, the Haitian Rebellion, which is actually the second independence movement in the New World, and it's a slave revolt, and it terrifies Jefferson and other Americans. It's actually significant for establishing, it may be as significant as the Cotton Gin for establishing the Cotton Kingdom in the South, because a lot of the slave owners who flee Haiti as a result of that come to the South, and they had been growing cotton in Haiti. So that was actually something that was new for me in that Empire of Cotton book I may or may not have told you about. But the, so, you know, it would seem unlikely that the entire world would abolish slavery and that would have no impact on the United States. Many Southerners will make the claim that if it hadn't been for those pesky abolitionists and do-gooder Northerners, they would have eventually freed the slaves themselves. But that it's kind of like if your parent keeps nagging you to do something, it may make you less likely to do it type thing. You can't make me. There could be an element of that going on. That being said, the slave system, the wealth of the slave system, the racism, endemic racism in the South, I don't see how it would have ended. But that's all counterfactual.
To a certain degree, it still exists today. Endemic racism.
Yeah, and apparently in the North as well as the South. But anyways, or maybe we do like to talk about it. I wanted to spend some time reviewing the causes of the Civil War as a major key thing that we need to make sure we understand. Are there any other sort of questions, issues that people want resolved? A reminder in terms of the review essays, please make sure you're reading the questions carefully. Please make sure you have thesis statements and not just outline. And please make sure that you're going for some synthesis type connections as well. Many of you have not been doing that. At the end of the day, it may not matter that much. But you know, for some of you, the synthesis point could end up being the difference between the 4 and a 5. And so if you don't go for the synthesis point, you get a 4. You go for the synthesis and get it, you get a 5. Or 3 and 4, whatever it happens to be. So because you can end up very close to the line, I would prefer to see you going for it than not. That involves practicing going for it. So there was a question that I think many of you answered last year that had to do with the periodization, where they asked about sort of origins of the sectional crisis. And I think they suggested 3 origins, and you were supposed to choose one, say which is best, choose one, say which is less good. This was a short answer. And the first was the Northwest Ordinance. By the way, just imagine you can read my handwriting. The second is the Missouri Compromise. The third was the U.S.-Mexican War, I believe. Now, the first thing to keep in mind is that with questions like this, which is best seen as the origin of the sectional crisis, there is never a right or wrong answer. There is a reasonable argument that could be made for each of these. And as an aside, when answering things like this, one of the, I've probably mentioned this to you before, but one of the things people are tempted to do is say, oh, well, the sectional crisis was started by the Missouri Compromise. Therefore, it couldn't have been the Mexican War because the Mexican War happened later. Make sure you say something about, well, what is more significant about the Missouri Compromise, as well as which came first. Because any of these can be argued. How would you argue the Northwest Ordinance? Sure.
Well, the Northwest Ordinance is what sets the precedence for creating territories that can eventually become states, correct?
It does.
So you could argue that without the Northwest Ordinance, you wouldn't have, I was gonna say,
There is something in addition that the Northwest Ordinance does, which is very specific.
is that,
that relates more closely than generic, how we're gonna get states.
Was it that how, didn't it also allow like settlers to start pushing into like the Ohio Valley or something?
Well, that's where they're gonna be settling. But what's the status of slavery going to be in the Northwest Territories?
Oh, it's not.
There's going to be no slavery in the Northwest Territories. So north of the Ohio River, so we're talking about Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, these are all going to be free of the institution of slavery. And this means that, and this is, by the way, the Articles of Confederation Congress is going to be drawing a line across the country between free areas and slave areas. And so by doing that, you've already, one, they've set a precedent for abolishing slavery or banning slavery in places. You have set up this idea of here's the free states, here's the slave states. And you've set in motion a process which is going to continue to play itself out over time with these sectional divisions. If you do not remember that the Northwest Ordinance banned slavery in those territories, then it's probably pretty hard to make this case. But it does. How would you make the case for the Missouri Compromise of 1820? John?
It drew a physical line between North and South. Is that, am I thinking the right thing? It actually like drew a physical division between northern states and southern states. Well, yeah, but the Missouri
No,
Compromise
he's right, there was like,
territories.
it was like the
Yeah,
20
because the bottom of Missouri, the top of Missouri. Yeah, the top of Missouri was the actual line where territories were slavery.
Oh, I didn't create this yet.
It's creating Maine instead of Missouri come in as a slave state.
Yeah, Maine free, Maine breaks away from Massachusetts, enters a free state. Missouri enters as a slave state, and basically the southern boundary of the Louisiana Purchase becomes the line between freedom and slavery, and that's often known as the 3630 line. So they have, I mean, in a sense, it was already a line. It's called the Ohio River, was the line between freedom and slavery. But now they have, in new territory across the Mississippi River, they have drawn a line. And remember, when this gets introduced into Congress, and you have the Talmadge Amendment that was put in, which don't lose sleep worrying about, but when this gets introduced, suddenly all of the northern states are like, hey, let's keep Missouri free or set up a gradual emancipation scheme. All of the southern states are like, no, that's a horrible idea. Jefferson starts talking about a fire bell in the night, the Union, it's the death knell of the Union, this is going to destroy everything. And so there's a pretty strong case that can be made for a Missouri Compromise, because this is the first time politically that these sectional tensions have such a great consequence. But after that, they're really able to quell them. And they have gag rules in Congress. You still, with the exception of John Quincy Adams, you have these southern slaveholder presidents. And so it's not a real issue. But then the US-Mexican War breaks out in 1846 and 1848, and what is this going to do?
It creates a whole undecided territory. You might say undecided slavery.
All right, so we have the acquisition of new territory, which is going to lead to the Compromise of 1850. I recently heard someone claim that nobody should be allowed to have citizenship or vote in the United States unless they can identify at least 4 of the points of the Compromise of 1850, and it was not Mr. Sackler. Jim is going to name all 8 right now. Go.
I don't think I can name it, but it was.
I don't think I can name it.
It makes California a free state. That was one.
All right, California is admitted as a free state. Why is that so significant?
Because it had like a big population.
It's south of the line. although there was some question as to whether or not the line applied to Mexican War territory. And it would upset the balance between the free and slave states that have been so carefully preserved for all this time. And so that balance will be gone for good.
It made, it strengthened the fugitive slave clause.
Yeah, you have the new fugitive slave law. Why is that so controversial?
The Northerners were like, I don't want to participate in slavery. And so,
Because the Northerners get compelled legally to catch runaway slaves and bring them back. So they feel it makes them morally complicit in this crisis. What else?
It opened up popular sovereignty to New Mexico and Arizona.
So in the rest of the Mexican cession. And what is popular sovereignty again? What's the theory behind it?
they get to vote for like what they want in their territory.
The actual settlers in an area get to determine whether it's going to be free or slave. Better as a theory than a reality. It causes all sorts of issues later on. They banned the slave trade in D.C. Mexican cession, I'm sorry. They banned the slave trade in D.C. So this is another absolutely crucial thing which is happening. But they actually protect slavery. There's a few other things with the validity of Texas debt. The federal government picks it up. Texas loses some land to New Mexico and a few other things which we don't really need to worry about. But for those of you who remember discussing this last year, is this a compromise? No. It is something that a bunch of drunk senators by the names of Henry Clay and Daniel Webster cobbled together, but then could not get past. That's sort of the legend, right? Webster's not supporting. Just have another drink. We'll work this out. But could not get past, and then it has to be forced through by Stephen Douglas by pairing separate bills. So the Deep South will never support a free California. They will never support banning the slave trade in D.C. The New England will never support the fugitive slave law. But they're able to grab the middle, the center of the country, the lower north, the upper south, sort of border states area. They're able to hold. The middle holds. But the question is, how long can this hold? I mean, imagine trying to reach some sort of political compromise between Bernie Sanders and Ted Cruz. It's not going to happen. It'd be easier to get a compromise between Trump and Sanders. But so they get this through, but it's sort of a poison pill in so many ways, especially the fugitive slave law. And so once the Mexican War happens and this sectional crisis over the expansion of slavery into territories gets started, then in a sense you can't stop the train. Now, are there other events prior to the 1850s that folks think should be mentioned in the context of the road to the Civil War? Prior to the 1850s. Kansas-Nebraska Act is an excellent thing to talk about after 1850. John? The Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, as you recall, were passed in 1799-ish, 1800.
Was it when South Carolina used them for the first time going on the road to the Civil War?
They cited them during the nullification.
Yeah, so it's mostly 1833. So just to put this in context, so Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, we're stretching back here to the Adams administration and the quasi-war with France. During this time, the Federalists passed something called the Alien and Sedition Act, in which they extend the citizenship period and limit the ability of, and sort of censor the press, limit the ability to criticize the president. In response to that, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison write 2 resolutions which get passed by the Virginia and Kentucky legislatures, saying that when Congress passes an unconstitutional law, such as the Alien and Sedition Acts, it is within the authority of states to effectively nullify those laws. That a state's right includes that idea. Now, do we believe today that states have the right to nullify federal laws?
Yes, in some cases, like with legalization of marijuana for recreational use.
So the state of Washington and Colorado effectively have passed laws that nullify federal laws. If you follow immigration debates closely, some places like San Francisco, probably Northampton, Massachusetts, have identified themselves as sanctuary cities, where they refuse to cooperate with the federal government in turning over undocumented immigrants for deportation. Is actually similar to the refusal of Northerners to cooperate with the fugitive slave law in the 1850s. So things like this can still happen today. But that's what Virginia and Kentucky, normally, if a federal law is unconstitutional, who's supposed to take care of it? Supreme Court. They do that first in Marbury v. Madison, very good. And so the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions are out there as an idea, and then during the nullification crisis, a lot of you talked about this in your essay outline, it gets brought out again. Now, a couple of quick thoughts on this. Number 1, who is the key proponent of nullification? Calhoun. What is Andrew Jackson's position on nullification?
No.
You can't do it, it's bad, no. A couple of you in your essay outlines said that Jackson supported nullification. He did not. So that's a rather significant point. And so Calhoun's from South Carolina, he supports nullification. Jackson, who's from Tennessee and a slaveholder, says, no, you can't just ignore federal law. Now, this turns out to be very, very significant because Lincoln in 1860 is reading, in 1861 more, is reading Jackson's statements on nullification to plot his response to Southern secession. So I mentioned this to B period, I may have upset someone when I said this. Those people want to second jump. Obviously Jackson's being removed from the $20 bill, and based on his attitude towards bankings and perhaps Native Americans, it's a good idea. But you can make, I think, a reasonable argument that the United States of America would not exist today were it not for the way Andrew Jackson handled the nullification crisis.
I think it's getting put on the back of one of the other bills. Like, it's getting a little bit ridiculous.
At the outbreak of secession, did the police state like, but for 1 hour, Jackson?
No, yeah, they did, because Andrew Jackson's the strong leader, says, no, you can't do this.
He responded with force to the Southern.
Yeah, and Calhoun is like, I'm sorry, not Calhoun, Buchanan's like, oh, whatever. I'm not going to do anything about this. I mean, he's a lame duck at that point. But what Jackson says is very significant. So nullification crisis here is absolutely crucial. A couple other things. Yeah, from 1831, you have Nat Turner. Also in 1831, this was probably on yesterday's quiz. Day before his quiz. Newspaper published for the first time in 1831. Liberator. It is not, at least in the minds of Southerners, an accident that these two things happen in the same year. It is very portentous. And this is what happens, you get abolitionist propaganda, then you're going to have the publication of the Liberator, and this is going to cause all these problems. Yes, Kate?
When does Uncle Tom's Cabin come out? Is that later?
Uncle Tom's Cabin is later. What is this?
Imperial Crisis?
Imperial Crisis. So post-1850, we have all sorts of massive things, which I'm going to mention. Who's leaving? the last 10 minutes of class, Jonah, you can't leave.
You guys are the face, it's really creepy.
Can you please erase that face?
No, even.
Uncle Tom's Cabin, 1852, Harry Beecher Stowe. Remember Lincoln calls her the little woman who started the big war. The most, I just heard this statistic, it was something unbelievable, that like for every person who voted in like the next election, 5 people had read Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Wow.
I mean, can you imagine any novel having that sort of like political import or impact today? Kansas, Nebraska, 1854. What is it? Well, Harper's Ferry, let's just say Bleeding, Kansas. Dred Scott, which we talked about. Harper's Ferry. 59, 57, sort of 54 and on. So what's so controversial about the Kansas-Nebraska Act?
Well, people from, it basically sets up popular sovereignty in Kansas, but a bunch of people from, like a bunch of slave owners from Missouri, and like a bunch of like pro-slavery whites start like pouring into the state and like voting illegally. And so it basically becomes like a mini civil war, where you have like pro-slavery and anti-slavery Kansas residents fighting each other.
Okay, Jonah, just a reminder, last 10 minutes of class, you're not allowed to leave. I thought that was going to be modified, and it wasn't. So Kansas, Nebraska, first really controversial thing it does is repeals the Missouri Compromise. Missouri Compromise is something that people think is settled law. And then all of a sudden, it's gone. So it'd be like a Supreme Court decision, say, overturning Roe v. Wade. Something that had been in place for a long time that people assumed was settled law, suddenly changing. So that's in place. Then slavery gets decided by popular sovereignty in both of these territories, which were designated as free by Missouri Compromise. This leads to border ruffians coming in from Missouri. This leads to Bleeding, Kansas. This leads to John Brown and his sons with the massacre at Potawatomi Creek. This leads to Preston Brooks, caning Charles Sumner after the Crime Against Kansas speech that Charles Sumner issues. This leads to the collapse of the Whig Party. This leads to the rise of the Republican Party. The last time a third party came up and displaced a previous party, it became the next major party. 1857, Dred Scott decision, like 3 days after Buchanan is inaugurated. 1858, you have the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Why don't we have Lincoln-Douglas debates? It's for a similar reason to what Caitlin said, that nobody reads anymore. Lincoln-Douglas debate format, are you ready? Candidate number 1, speak for 60 minutes. Candidate number 2, respond for 90 minutes. Candidate number 1, re-respond for 30 minutes. There you have it, 3-hour-long debate, no moderators, no questions, just 3 speeches.
So candidate 2 doesn't get to have their own point?
No, candidate 2 is 90 minutes, so candidate 1, 60, candidate 2, 90.
Yeah, but you said they're just responding to what the first guy
They
said.
can make it a candidate.
They respond in
Or like
their
they can say,
statement.
they can say anything, so they can
Yeah.
respond and then
Alright, because I was going to say, they're definitely
say
going
what
to
they say later.
Yeah, well, I mean, there might be better ways of organizing it, but that's the way they did it. I don't think anybody would sit through that today, but you might have much more reasoned discourse than we're getting today. It always pains me to listen to like the victory speeches and just the platitudes.
I don't think I could listen to any politician talk for 90 minutes. Like, no matter who it is, just no one. Like, I don't know if I could listen to anyone talk for 90 minutes.
I have noticed that my attention
Those were not fun times where I was like, what?
But, so then Harper's Ferry, obviously, John Brown's raid, trying to capture the federal arsenal in Harper's Ferry and starting massive slave revolts. Questions? I wanted to just mention to folks, in putting together tomorrow's quiz, I noticed that in many of the released things I've seen, huge emphasis on Reconstruction. I would pay some extra time to Reconstruction. Also, Reconstruction is the last of the US One topics. So as you get into post-Civil War West and industrialization, that's stuff from your notes from this year, from September. Catherine, you had a question?
How did they decide that California would be a free state?
California wanted to be free. It was mostly settled in the north around San Francisco because of the gold rush, and they accepted that in exchange.